DESTINY-Breast04 was a phase 3 randomized double-blind trial that sought to evaluate the efficacy and safety of the antibody-drug conjugate Trastuzumab Deruxtecan in patients with HER2-low metastatic or unresectable breast cancer who had received 1 to 2 lines of prior chemotherapy compared to chemotherapy of physician choice called TPC, treatment of physician choice. In DESTINY-Breast04, more than 50% of patients in the TPC arm received eribulin with the other standard chemotherapy agents following, including capecitabine and gemcitabine and taxanes. So what DESTINY-Breast04 showed in this patient population who had HER2-low disease is incredibly important and has been practice changing. So the primary endpoint of the trial was to look at progression-free survival in hormone receptor-positive HER2-low disease. And then they had an exploratory endpoint looking at patients who had hormone receptor-negative HER2-low disease, and they were going to enroll 60 patients. They enrolled 58. HER2-low is defined as being IHC 1 plus or 2 plus without gene amplification, and there's a lot of controversy about now identifying how low you can go and still get efficacy, like how much do you really need to express the target, and we've seen this with these new antibody drug conjugates. So we'd already seen that the antibody drug conjugate has fairly well tolerated. We understood the safety profile. This was actually a really in-depth analysis of the safety profile to look to see what specific events we could look at differently. And what we saw was that neutropenia, febrile neutropenia, was more common in patients receiving the treatment of physician choice versus T-DXd. Interestingly, the most common toxicities of T-DXd, nausea, vomiting, and then the unique toxicity of interstitial lung disease, pneumonitis, those were more frequent in the T-DXd arm. But all the other sort of standard toxicities we think about, including alopecia, were more common in the treatment of physician choice arm. So that was one area that we were able to show. We also looked at the time course, both of onset of events and resolution, and most of the events occurred fairly early. So certainly the nausea and if you had any other GI side effects, they occurred early. And then hematologic side effects, although they occurred much less frequently with T-DXd, if you were going to get them, they did occur early. And most of the results, most of the toxicities resolved fairly quickly, but the anemia, as you would expect, because anemia takes a long time to resolve, was the longest to resolve. We looked also at the time, median time to onset of interstitial lung disease, and that was more in the 4-month-ish range. So, you know, interstitial lung disease occurs generally in the first year of treatment with T-DXd, but it takes a few months to see sort of the median time to development. The time to resolution of ILD was also interesting because it was a little over 40 days, about 46 days, and it's longer than I would have guessed and from my clinical practice, but they didn't mandate that you receive steroids for grade 1 asymptomatic CT scan detected ILD, but I always gave steroids 0.5 milligram per kilogram. So I think that's why you see a much more rapid resolution if you give the steroids for 3 weeks and re-image after 3 weeks, which is our standard practice. We also looked to see what the grade of ILD was and outcome, and already had been reported that 3 patients died of grade 5 ILD, 0.8%. But the majority of events were low grade, which is very encouraging. I've been very interested in what happens when patients have grade 1 ILD. It goes away, and then you retreat. And that was really interesting. I mean, of the patients whose grade 1 went away, very few were retreated, which is fascinating. Now, whether that's due to the fact that people were afraid to retreat or patients had progressive disease, we don't know. But of the patients who were retreated, the 6 patients, 1 of them went off for an adverse event, 2 went off for progressive disease, and 3 patients stayed on therapy for the median follow-up of 18 months. So it's too small a number of patients, but it brings up a lot of interest in further evaluating what happens to patients who have grade 1 image-only asymptomatic ILD that resolves and then are retreated with T-DXd. Our personal experience has been very good, so we hope to be able to expand that analysis as we move forward, looking at patients who are retreated in many settings. Then the last thing we looked at was whether there were differences in adverse events by age. And as you would expect, and as we see in all cases, the higher grade adverse events were slightly higher in the women who were 65 years or older, but the all grade events were very similar across age groups. So that was encouraging. I mean, I think that we're not seeing, for example, more interstitial lung disease or death in older patients. So that's really encouraging. But there are higher grade events. It may be that patients have more nausea and vomiting if they're older. And they may be slightly more prone to bone marrow suppression, which is an uncommon toxicity of T-DXd. So, this is remarkable data from DESTINY-Breast04, practice changing, and T-DXd improved progression-free and overall survival in the patients with hormone receptor positive HER2 low disease, and in the intent to treat analysis, and in an exploratory analysis of the 58 patients with triple negative disease in this 2-to-1 randomized trial. So, understanding the safety implications is critical for optimally managing our patients, keeping them safe, and for them to tolerate the treatment, because people will stay on drug for a long time. So this is in some ways even more critical than when we treat patients for just a few months before disease progression.